Okay, we're now being recorded. Okay, welcome to you all. I'm really pleased that some of you managed to log into this, and I'd like to welcome all of those people out there who are watching this as it's recorded. I'll just adjust the camera a little bit. What I'm going to do today is bring you an introduction to this course, A History of New Zealand's Peoples. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to talk a lot about the 1950s. And the 1950s are a particular, I think if you think of New Zealand's history as being an hourglass, particularly if we're looking at the kind of world that is New Zealand, then the 1950s are that narrow bit in between. Before the 1950s, we have all of the world that occurred before the 1950s, then after the world. But in 1950, New Zealand is a particular, quite comfortable, quite prosperous, but very homogeneous place. And why I want to talk about that is that it has a real influence on how historians actually interpret the past, because my generation and the generation perhaps for 10, 15 years later grew up in the 50s and 60s. And our interpretation of history is very much dominated by that. And the thing I'm trying to get across is that history is both, it's fact, there are things that happen, but it's also about myth building and nation building and even deconstructing the idea, taking apart the idea that New Zealand is a nation. So we're concentrating here on how we look at New Zealand's history rather than what that history might be. So I'm going to start with the 1950s because I'm going to argue here that most of the historians that have published on New Zealand history in the 1960s, 70s and 80s are kind of reacting against the 1950s. They see it as conformist, very British, keeping women in a very domestic environment, treating Māori as being nice, happy fellas who deal with the world with humour, but don't really form a central part in New Zealand life. So strong accusations of racism will be dealt with at that period. And obviously very harsh on people who are different because of colour, different because of particularly sexual orientation. So since that time, historians have actually been writing about New Zealand history and trying to escape their own childhoods. And perhaps we all do that to some extent. I'm skipping over that. Those are some questions that I asked the internal students, which is really to think about, is New Zealand history interesting, and why is the history interesting, and how does it compare with the other kinds of histories that we have? I think there's a general view out there that New Zealand history is boring for a number of reasons, mainly because our history is so recent. There's a kind of sense that people rush off to the medieval world because there must be more there because it's so far away. But I'd suggest that one of the reasons that New Zealand's history is interesting is that it's a small microcosm of some of the biggest things that have occurred in world history over the last 200 years. The expansion of empire, the ability for indigenous people to be dominated by colonization and to resist that, the imposition of industrialization on the environment, the development of a modern consumer participant culture, the growth of individualism, a whole series of massively important things. And New Zealand provides a really nice test case because it's such a small country. So what is interesting about New Zealand history? I have to admit to you, I never did a single history course on New Zealand history when I was an undergraduate student at Waikato or a postgraduate student at Auckland. All of my New Zealand history has been postgraduate, my master's thesis, my PhD, and all of the work I've done since. Why was I not interested in New Zealand history? Because I did New Zealand history at Waikato, and the leading New Zealand history was as boring as they come. I went to his first 2 lectures, decided that that was enough, and went off and did European and American and Asian history. So let's go back to the 1950s. Wave your hand, you guys, if any of you watched Reign, the story of Queen Elizabeth I and their appendage of a husband, Phil the Greek. That is a wonderful historical drama to watch. And it deals with this royal tour where the Queen is separated from her children, sent around the world, but it doesn't deal with the New Zealand version. Here's a really interesting statement that's being made about New Zealand in the 1950s. You'll see that the dignitaries are all wearing cloaks. They're all being, the Maori world is not being ignored. However, you'll notice that the flag at the back is not actually the New Zealand flag, is it? It's the British flag. It's the Union flag. Now, I'm just going to, this will come up as a video, and I don't think you can hear it because I tried to get it to transmit. I'm going to put it online so you can watch it, but I'll just summarize the things that are in it. This is a, can any of you hear that at all?
Yeah, I can.
Oh, good.
Very, very faintly.
So this is about the royal tour. Can you hear me as well?
Yes.
That's interesting because last night I couldn't get it to work. Now what I'm going to try and do is get it to go on a bit. This is the problem. Let's just watch some of the beginning of it. Notice that New Zealand is called home, mother country, Britain of the South. See, we might be in the southern hemisphere, but we still have a good cold British dinner for Christmas dinner.
Wow.
Splendidly loyal country. Oh, damn it. Sorry, I've been trying.
Oh.
I've got my Zoom thing sitting right in the middle of this. No, it's done it again. She went to almost every tin pot town in the country. Some of the towns that she went to don't exist anymore. Did you see what those flags were? They weren't New Zealand flags, were they? They were British flags.
We'll jump back again, I think.
Okay, I'm going to stop there. No, I am going to stop there. Okay, we've come back again. Do you want to just flip your things off mute so that you can say something?
Yeah, I think I already am.
Okay. What are the key characteristics that are being sold to a British audience about New Zealand in that video?
Well, it is, if you can hear me. Hi, guys, by the way. I think it's trying to be sold as a miniature or Little Britain. I mean, even the very start of it, I'm a bit of an animal buff, as you know, Michael. I noticed the very first shot, all the cattle that were jerseys, imported British cattle. We weren't even using, New Zealand bred livestock right from there. And everything from the flowers that were growing, seemed to be British. And so it was almost like a microcosm of the British Empire, perhaps, being transplanted from one side of the world to another.
Did anyone get that thing about how the New Zealand landscape had changed? You know, what the pioneers had done?
Clear felling.
Clear felling, getting rid of the native bush, replacing it with pasture, replacing it with British flowers.
Yeah.
All of that was coming through really, really strongly. You saw the Māori concert party on the side of the road. There's quite a lot of, and you saw that the marching with cloaks on. There's quite a lot of attention to Māori in this video. Now, you haven't seen enough to make a conclusion, but have any of you sort of guessed how Māori are being depicted in this video?
Oh, very much as a sort of showpiece, sort of at the side of what's actually the real business, rather than being central.
Yeah. Katrina, did you get any sense of?
Yeah, that it sort of depicted them as still living, well, not as British as, like still living in the past, so to speak.
Oh,
It made it seem like they weren't as advanced.
Well, it's yeah, no, that's true. But they are treated as really loyal subjects.
Yeah.
So they're kind of included. There's almost a kind of biculturalism here. But you're quite right. You're quite right that Māori are treated as being Māori in a kind of cultural way. There's a picture in the film of a supposed Māori village, which is a site from Rotorua of the villages. Not the waka that people live in, but the artificial village that was created and is still there today. And people are dressed up in clothing that they hadn't worn since before Europeans came. So there's a sense of Māori as being a sort of historical curiosity, happy, go lucky, culturally important, really important in the way that New Zealand presents itself. And of course, a tribute to the good race relations of good British colonisation. Okay, anything else about that? I mean, notice just the whole attempt to say that New Zealand is more Britain than Britain. You know, exactly on the other side, temperate zone, island nation, shows pictures of paddocks and hills that would look not out of place in a British landscape. And then, of course, all the flowers. Would we describe New Zealand in those ways today? Wesley, what do you think?
No, probably not as much. I think it's sort of developed more of its own individual culture that's sort of deliberately tried to separate itself from Britain. Well, in recent times, anyways. But yeah, that's what I'd say, anyways.
What's interesting is that we'd still have a concert party turn up to welcome people.
Yeah.
That institution is still exactly the same. Hi, Sarah. Wave if you can hear us. All right, I'm going to continue. The point about this, what's really interesting about the 1950s is that for the generation that came afterwards, this is how New Zealand is described up until the 1950s. So when people look at the 1950s, they often see the world that existed from first colonists right up to the 1950s. It's a really homogeneous world. Now, I'm just going to flip back to the share screen and just show you a little bit more about New Zealand in the 1950s and just talk about that. It's an era that I remember. It's a baby boom era, so this is an era where there are lots and lots of children, and policy is geared to deal with young babies, mothers, and children. The baby boomers are in full breeding, I won't go any further. They bred a lot. They had a lot of kids, and they had them younger than it occurred beforehand. You see the bus on the left there, picking up the prams. People didn't have cars, they had to rely on public transport. Very often that public transport wasn't really available much. I knew an American soldier who stayed in New Zealand after the war, and he drove a bus, and he was such a nice guy. So he used to take these women up their streets in the bus and turn the bus around and take them right to their houses and take the prams off for them and everything. And of course, he didn't last very long as a bus driver because he didn't get through his timetable. So this is a world that is recovering from a post-war period. Now, when we look back on that world, we look back on it having known something about what happened since and knowing about the present. Those people that we're looking at in that picture, they have no idea what happened after that picture is taken. They don't know anything about what happens after that event. If they're thinking about their time, they can only compare it with the time that went before, with the Depression and the war. So for the 1950s, for many people, this is a golden era. This is an era without warfare and certainly without the kind of poverty that had been there in the 1930s. So when we look at it, We look back on it as being quite stilted, uniform, not treating diversity well, keeping women in the home, putting homosexual men into prison, having all sorts of laws that make it harder for women to earn money than men, including taxes, different salaries. So for us, we have to realize that when we look at the past, we take us in the present back there too. But those people that we're looking at, they can't do that. Just a couple of other things. State housing. How do we treat state housing today? Often state housing is seen as housing of last resort. Public housing across the world has been treated pretty badly in the 70s as a failed experiment. You think of those big high-rises in England that were blown up because of the disaster that they were. But in the 1950s, when you got a state house, you got a far better house than you lived in the slum conditions in towns. So when you got a state house, you were going up in the world because the living conditions that you had in these houses were so much better than what you'd been experiencing. Those state houses, this is not a state house, and I think it's probably 1960s because there's some sort of a ranch slider being put in there. But this is the standard sort of 1,000 square foot, 100 square meter house that families, much bigger families that we have today. Today, these houses are regarded as tiny and nobody's building them, unfortunately, because they're needed. But if you had your 6 kids, you lived in one of these houses, and you had a lawn, and you had a garden, and you had a shed out the back. And sometimes you had a car to go in the shed, but not necessarily. This was the ideal world that was created in the 1950s, school milk. Barbara, were you around when school milk was?
Yes, I was. I certainly was. And it's back, of course, today.
So, yes, it's back today, but in those days there was no refrigeration. It was
No, so it was slightly warm.
Box frames at the end of the school gate where it got decently warm in the summer by 10 o'clock when you had to drink it.
Milk. Oh, my husband's just coming and going, milk.
One of my teachers had a big black pot over a fire in the corner, and she used to heat it all up, and we'd have Milo.
Yeah.
But the 50s are also changing. On the left, we have an example of youth culture, which is undergoing change. These bodgies and widgies and the milk bar cowboys that they were called were starting to scare people in the 1950s. They scared people because they had motorbikes. They were independent of adult control. They had money of their own. For the first time, young people could go and work and get money of their own and not have to hand it over to their parents. So it's a world that is sitting there, not looking backwards, thinking the future is going to be built very much like it is in the present, but it's a world that from the 1960s on is going to undergo very dramatic change. Just another comment about growing up in this period is that we often had access to rural areas, even if we lived in cities. I lived in a city but spent much of my time in hay paddocks and in wilderness areas and creeks and the like, climbing trees, and did so with my own generation, without any parental supervision. You got home from school, you did your homework, then you disappeared until you were called for tea. And nobody worried where you were because you were with 10 or 11 others roaming, which didn't mean it wasn't dangerous. And there were things I look back on and think, my God, we were lucky we weren't killed. So it's a world that came and a world that went. In this course, we're trying to look at how that world was created. And that world that before the 1950s is far more diverse and far more varied than the 1950s. But the problem is that many people see the 1950s and they see that as the entire history of New Zealand prior to the 1970s and 80s. if you add in a few wars and a few other sort of things that involve Māori, then you kind of get what the picture of New Zealand might be. There were, however, I've already talked about the young people. The beginning of the 50s, there's a major lockout strike on the waterfront. That's a big confrontation. The second most important confrontation in the 1950s is actually the Springbok Tour in 1956. And it wasn't because they were Springboks, it was because New Zealand beat them for the first time. Even Waikato beat them. My dad was there. It was the biggest day for Waikato rugby. It was beating the Springboks in 1956. Kind of beginnings of the movements of protest that we would see later in 1960, 4 years later. Māori were excluded, Māori players were excluded from the team that was going to South Africa in 1960, and for the first time there was protest about it. You can see My Old Man's an All Black came out in the same year. Howard Morrison's Māori tribute to being an All Black, alongside the protest movement just starting, very small, but really quite significant in 1960. Why I'm focusing on this is that this is the world that most historians grew up in, and how they see this world has a really significant view in how that history has been shaped. Now, this is changing. We now have a generation of historians born in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and even 1990s, and some of you, as younger people, are part of that. We've seen in politics today, I don't know, who's become leader of the National Party? Do we know yet? No. We're seeing a handover of a generation. So the generation that ruled New Zealand until 1984 was the generation of the baby boomers, the people who grew up in the Depression and went to war. 1984, you have a shift to the new generation, which were those people who are the baby boomers who were born in the 40s and 50s. Now we're seeing that generation give way to people born in the 1970s and 1980s. Jacinda marks the first thing, but whoever we think is going to be leader of the National Party will also be probably 37. So that's a shift. And as historians shift in time, they shift their perspective. So this is a good example. Māori coming to the cities is one of the biggest features of the 1950s. Not dealt with at all in that video, and yet it's a huge thing. Those anthropologists who studied it saw it as a really positive thing in the 1950s because they saw Māori communities better off, better housed, with more work, but still keeping rural roots alive. The next generation, the protest generation of the 70s, saw this urbanization as another form of colonization, cultural colonization. They're the ones beating the drums in the background at the moment. But now, a new generation of historians, third generation in the cities, much more comfortable with being Māori, are now looking at that urbanization process much more positively. Melissa Matutina Williams is an example of this. Her iwi came from the north, came to Auckland, and the story that she tells through their oral histories is much more positive about that migration. When her book was launched, one of her participants, someone she'd interviewed, stood up and said, "We came to Auckland for a better life and we got it, and we've had it." Now that interpretation wouldn't have been very listened to in the 1980s and 1990s. So as generations change, as our experience change, our experience of history changes as well. So about the 1950s, what this course is looking at, what happened before the 1950s, what happened after the 1950s, and did the 1950s really exist? So to what extent is that mythology of the 1950s in that video being created? And I still feel a child of the 1950s. I look at that photograph and I see what looks like my mother-in-law, what looks like my father-in-law in it, though I know that they're not, but they look very much like them, that I had to look twice to make sure. So I'm going to actually use that to talk about how we should approach the different kinds of history that's been written about New Zealand. And I've divided them into three groups, which is a very stereotypical thing to do: nationalists, anti-nationalists, and the historians of groups. Nationalist historians are not those people who stand on their heart and say that New Zealand is the best country ever. They're not the kind of American patriot. They're not usually right-wingers either. They're often kind of left-wingers. Nationalists, there are two features of nationalist history. Both come and end with New Zealand being an independent nation state in the South Pacific. And in particular, having an independent culture, its own music, its own poetry, its own painting, its own cinema, and certainly its own political and constitutional independence. So nationalist historians tell the story of New Zealand as coming from either the British Empire to becoming independent. And that 1950 video makes it appear that New Zealand still had a long way to go to becoming independent. But nationalist historians by the late 1950s are starting to show that New Zealand will become an independent nation state, and they see that as a good thing. How they deal with Māori history is really interesting, because they kind of acknowledge that, you know, really bad things were done, but they often blame that on empire. And they see the emergence of a nation state as, in fact, coming to grips with racism, coming to grips with that, that past. Māori, on the other hand, might not be quite so convinced about that argument. So historians of this ilk are people like Keith Sinclair, Michael King, and Jamie Belich. Now, the anti-nationalists are historians much more recently. These are historians who have reacted against nationalism. And there are a number of reasons why they might react against nationalism. Obviously, Māori historians see nationalism or the nation state as the enemy, particularly in terms of iwi history. What New Zealand tended to do, and I'm going to use this word exceptionalism, and I think it's a word that you need to remember, exceptionalism. It's the argument that New Zealand is actually different from anywhere else. And New Zealand exceptionalism, Australian exceptionalism, American exceptionalism, these settled societies have built up pictures that are nationalistic because they say we are distinct. And you can see how in the 1950s, Māori are being used, literally being used, to make that distinctness obvious, even though it's within an imperial setting. So telling Māori stories and the story of race relations has been one of those features that that nationalist historians has seen as telling a unique story. But the anti-nationalists are saying, wait a minute, colonization occurs across the board. Colonization and imperialism occur for Samoans, they occur for Aboriginal Australians, they occur for First Nations people in Canada, they occur for Native Americans in the United States. It is a universal process, and New Zealand is but one example of that process. So to understand New Zealand, we can't just look at it in isolation. We have to look at it in that broader picture of how empire and colonization and the fate of indigenous peoples have been decided over recent centuries even. Other historians have said it's really locality that's much more important. Locality is where history takes place, whether it be on a marae or for a whānau or an iwi or for a local community. That's what we should be studying. And if we study those things, then the national picture might not seem that significant. And other anti-nationalists are saying, well, wait a minute, New Zealand in the 19th century is just an Australasian colony. It needs to be seen as part of Australia, not as an independent, distinct country. And these ideas have reflected even in the national histories that have been written. There have been 2 national histories. The latest Oxford History of New Zealand, which Giselle Burns edited, and she's the AVC academic and everything else at Massey at the moment. She edited that Oxford History, which is really an attack on the idea of a national history. And another national history done by Philippa Mein Kampf, Philippa Mein Kampf, oh my God, sorry Philippa, I should edit that out. Philippa Mein Smith, who's descended from one of the first surveyors of the New Zealand Company. That's the Cambridge history of New Zealand, a concise history. She too is trying to see New Zealand as part of an international economic and social network, not specifically as a nation state. And if you look at the two of the readings that you've got there this week, one's by Jamie Balich, which is looking at the evolution of history, the kind of things I've been talking about. And the other one is by Tony Ballantyne. And Tony Ballantyne looks as if he's doing a micro study of Gore. Anyone been through Gore? It's a very small place in the South Island. Yes, I've been through it. So if he's writing about Gore, but what he's saying about Gore actually is about empire. It's about the way that settlers transfer themselves into a new place. And he's saying they don't come to New Zealand. They come to places like Gore. It's Gore they're coming to. Yes, they travel to New Zealand, but when they get to these small towns, they don't participate in a national life. They join the local church. They join a rugby club or a cricket club. They join a philosophical society. They join a community organisation. And when they join a community organisation, they're joining an international network. They'll be part of that church from where they've come. So when they come to New Zealand, when they become colonists, they're part of this sort of international network of empire, and they settle down and they make themselves at home almost straight away, because the institutions that they join are institutions that they're already familiar with. They don't have to make a new country. A new country is being readily created around them. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is, yeah, here we are. There's the British Empire as it was in its heyday. So there's a number of different ways about how we talk about New Zealand history. Progress. That video in the 1950s is really about progress. New Zealand has progressed. It's become agricultural. It's become developed. It's got a civilized society. We have to be careful about talking about progress of morality. You know, are we better now because we have the Human Rights Act that respects the rights of women, of people of different ethnicities, of people of different genders and social and sexual selection? Does that make us better or just different? So the idea of birth to national maturity, that's that nationalist picture. Colonisation and Māori resistance is another theme in New Zealand history. Then there's that idea of the melting pot, that coming to New Zealand, groups were forced to assimilate or wanted to assimilate and produce that kind of national culture that we see in the 1950s. And then there's the idea that New Zealand, migrants to New Zealand, always retain some aspect of the world that they've come from. It's almost a nurture-nature debate. How often are you in New Zealand as a New Zealander, whatever you might be as a citizen? Are you born by nurture? In other words, are you created here as a New Zealander, or has your nature, has your migrant experience, your cultural experience, the world that you came from, also defined who you are? Okay, we've got these waves of migrants that we're going to be looking at in the course. Māori, Pākehā Māori, Wakefield settlers, miners, British stock, Pacific Island and the world. These are the main sort of themes of migrant life. And then we've got all of these other communities that have come along the way and have settled here and in some way maintained their identity or assimilated. So the course is very much concerned both with all of the groups that are there, but how we see them becoming part of a national or a local community. To what extent they assimilate or assimilated, whether that assimilation is voluntary or forced, and to what extent they can maintain your own cultural identity in this new place. Okay, that about gets me to where I was going. So I'd like to thank you for joining me. Are there any questions that you want to raise? You might have to put your things back onto mute. I'm going to...
Yeah, Michael, are we able to get the PowerPoint so that we can scribble better on your, can we get that in a PDF form or something?
Sorry, get what? I can't quite hear.
A PDF of the PowerPoint so we can scribble away what we've been scribbling.
I will put a PDF of the PowerPoint up.
Awesome.
And then this video is also going to be available online.
Awesome.
Hi, Sarah and Molly.
Hi.
Molly, you're on.
Hello.
You've just missed it. We've just finished.
Oh no, I was watching the whole time.
Oh, you were here. Oh, that's good.
Yeah, I was.
You were hiding.
Yeah, I had to. Yeah.
Okay, Sarah, did you manage to hear anything?
Yes, I did. I'm sorry. I've been up at Massey on campus this morning, and I just got back, so I've joined in the tail end of it. Thank you. Great, and I'm pleased that you're going to make the video available to watch.
Okay, so you can go back to the video, and the other distance students can as well. Thank you for joining. I really appreciate it. I'm going to turn off the record now so that